Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, folks. And thank you to Herefords Australia for the invitation to be here. I used to think that the worst thing that could happen to a speaker was to be first up after lunch at the death seat. I now know it's to be immediately after Jack Ward. So I won't go into any length here. I can sum up my association with beef cattle pretty quickly with just a simple photo. I've been around beef cattle for quite some time. Let's set the scene because quite a lot of what I'll have to say is probably going to be controversial or upset people, so I have to explain where I'm coming from a bit, and we'll start from big picture and work down. And the first one is this, followed by that. So imagine how good agriculture would be if it was evidence-based, and how good the beef industry would be if it was evidence-based. And so I'm going to try hard to present my stuff from an evidence perspective. Unfortunately, agriculture is not evidence-based. The bulk of it is based on myth, tradition and bullshit, frankly. And the transition from that approach to it to the way I've always worked is a bit of a leap. What's going on there? Here's an example of evidence and how it can be used and interpreted. Those data there are the average price of all Australian beef going back to 1985, so there's 34 years of data there. It's the average price of all beef sold expressed in live weight terms, and it's been adjusted for inflation and it's expressed in 2019 dollars. What do you see? The first thing you see is 4 of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, and a few slides. Now, what causes them? Go home and Google the beef price cycle and you'll find out. The point is that in that time period, there's been about one of those things a decade. That means, well, what that results in is that in that period, this pattern goes back to the 1960s, so it's long established. That actually ends up in, for everyone in this room and every beef producer in Australia, about 80% of the total profit you generate in any one decade comes from only 3 of those years. The rest of the time, no, you're just holding your own or struggling. So you have to be set up and ready for that. You have to be investing heavily in improved productivity through these periods here in between, so that when these things come along, you capture all of it. They don't last very long and you've got to capture them or they're gone. Nobody I know predicted that. Nobody I know predicted that. So, lesson number 1. Don't believe any forecasts at all. Screen jockeys who predict what's going to happen to prices in agricultural commodities, when I become Prime Minister, they'll all be shot. These screen jockeys here that do this with beef and grain and so on, they're almost, but not quite as bad as the Bureau of Meteorology. Secondly, when you understand this and the bigger picture and these price spikes on average once a decade, what the hell is there else to talk about? You know, when beef cockies get together, what do they talk about? The beef price and rainfall. You can't do anything about either, so why the hell talk about it? All you need to understand is that this happens and you've got to know where you are in the cycle and plan accordingly. So, there's some evidence, and that evidence hopefully results in a different way of looking at the beef price. Okay, what's the current state of the beef industry nationally? Well, here's some things to think about. Number 1, All of the profit generated by the Australian beef industry comes from 25% of the producers. So they own half the herd and half the land under management across Australia. All of the profit in the industry is only coming from 25% of the producers. The other 75%, the profit generated by them is equally cancelled out by the loss of the same cohort. So it cancels itself out. That's appalling, that situation, but it gets worse. The majority of beef producers right across the country, north and south, can either pay themselves a decent wage or bank interest, but not both. What's a decent wage? Most people that I've seen over the years draw from the farm account, and it's way below the average weekly earnings of the average Australian worker. It's not good. There's no chance, absolutely no chance, of them being able to reduce debt principal significantly and provision for the future. And the two biggest provisioning events, which can destroy families and businesses, are independent retirement and succession of the business. They're underfunded in most farm businesses and beef businesses. There are different issues in the north and in the south. In northern Australia, the main issue is poor productivity. The herds up there are poorly productive. They've got operating scale, but the productivity is pretty dreadful. In the south, productivity is better, but the big issue down here is operating scale. The herds are just too small. So look, the reality today is, if you want to have an independent beef business where it's providing the family with all its financial needs, you need an absolute minimum of 20,000 DSEs. That equates to 1,000 breeding cows. If you haven't got that, you'll either have to get bigger or go out and get a job off farm, because that business will be incapable of providing that family with the financial needs that most people have. There's no evidence that that's been getting any better for over a decade, and there's no rocket science needed to fix it, and hopefully I can show that as this presentation goes on. How do I know all this stuff? Evidence. And it's all in that publication. It was published in 2017, and just about all you need to know to show you why all that is happening and what you can do about it is in that, if you care to Google it. Okay, that's where we are at the moment. Now, I'm getting to the stage in my career where I'm not trying to take on any new work to try to help other people I don't know to get any better. I'm trying to wind down. So I'm going to show you what I have been doing now with 6 large New South Wales herds. The longest standing of those I've been working with for 30 years. All of them are well above 10 years. And we have put into place a system that I'm proud of and they are also proud of. And I'll show you how what we do differs from what the majority do, and hopefully lead you to think about it a bit. In doing this, I'm not saying if you don't do this, you're an idiot. I'm just saying what we have done and what we continue to do, and you can take from it what you will. So I'm going to show you the profile of these herds and how they think and what they do, and then leave it to you to judge. Number one, this is the first and most important thing. You've got to set a business target. Once you set that, everything starts to fall away from it. Number one, 4% return on assets, absolute minimum level entry point. You have to be aiming for at least 4%. You will operate in the Australian beef industry in a range of 4 to 7% over time, but it's next to impossible to get above 7. And if you're aiming for 4, you need an absolute minimum of $30 EBIT, earnings before interest and tax, or profit if you like, per DSE. you set those two targets, suddenly your world will change. If you're under 4%, you're mucking around, really, not having a go. The average of all Australian agriculture is 0.9 of 1%, which will send you broke, really. Right, so you set those targets, then what happens? First of all, you must do this. I don't care where you are, really don't care, unless you're in certain parts of Queensland. Calve in spring. Well, we cannot afford to calve at any other time than in the spring period in these herds. We cannot match feed supply with feed demand properly and cost effectively, and our feeding costs go up and our stocking rate goes down if we calve at any other time of year. Unfortunately, I wasn't treated with the grace that Jack was, and I was advised that I might have to tone my stuff down and not talk too much about bloody Angus. But after Jack, to hell with it. So we all crossbreed, all 6 herds. They're all black baldy herds, the whole lot of them. We cannot afford not to crossbreed. 10% hybrid vigour. That's not only free, it's better than that. It comes at a lower cost by crossbreeding Herefords and Angus, as you'll see. 10% hybrid vigour cannot be ignored, so that's what we do. We conduct an annual bull breeding soundness evaluation for very sound reasons, and I'll show you the data on that as we proceed. All herds are mated for 6 weeks to 2% bulls. And in 3 of those 6 herds, we're now moving to a 4-week mating for heifers. And we're losing about 2 to 3% of pregnancy rates by doing that, not much. It's taken a while to get to that point because we've had to build in genotypic fertility into the herds, not just phenotypic. You'll get phenotypic fertility by preg testing all the time and doing all that sort of stuff. But if you get genotypic fertility in, one of the advantages of mating heifers for 4 weeks is, well, the biggest advantage we've found so far in practical terms is that our pregnancy rates of first calvers, getting in calf for the second time, the notoriously bad group in any herd with the lowest pregnancy rates, when we mate heifers for 4 weeks, the next pregnancy rates are starting to rise as a function of that. 2% bulls, I don't care if you're in Cape York, the Kimberley or Tasmania, you do not need more than 2% bulls. In fact, if you mate at more than 2%, you'll incur greater bull costs over time. This is why we mate for 6 weeks. Most producers don't understand this arithmetic, and it's pretty simple. Gestation length in Bos Taurus broods, 283 days. The number of days needed to start cycling again after they calve is an average of 40 days. You mate for 42 days or 6 weeks, total 365. Every day you extend mating beyond 42 days, the wider you open the back door on the herd and let more sub-fertile cows into the system and leak through all the time. Must be 6 weeks. It's arithmetically impossible to have every cow in the herd delivering a calf every year if you mate for longer than 6 weeks. You go down to the pub, yeah, we got 92% in our heifers, pregnancy testing. And the conversation will go on, and you'll find out pretty quickly that to do that, that bloke had to mate for 9 to 12 weeks to get it to happen in most herds. So that's why we do that. Carrying on, that's what we get from that system. Maiden heifers, about 88% pregnancy rates and 92% in the cows. We've got too many calves coming on. Trying to improve that. You're right out at the margin, and the cost of getting that any better than that will be exceeded by the costs in doing so. So that's another reason why we're not too concerned about going back to 4 weeks. That's straightforward. We would like to get it to 0. I don't think we will. I learned very early on in my career that dead calves have distressingly low growth rates. So having to do that sort of thing, there's no future in it. When I become Prime Minister, weaner sales will be banned. You cannot be profitable if you calve in the autumn or winter and sell into weaner sales. By all means go and do it if that blows your hair back. We can't afford to do it. We just cannot afford to do it. We like to get them up to 500, so that's about the top of the grid for feedlot entry in New South Wales. Over that, they're not too happy about them, and it gets you into the lower end of the grid for a grass-fed kill. So we've got 2 market options by targeting that exit weight. So we've got to have reasonably good growth genetics and good pasture management to do that. Now, this concept here may be foreign to many, but it's terribly important. So we want every calf on the ground with a price tag sitting on its head as a function of bull costs. We want that price tag to be less than $30. And I'll explain what that means in a minute and why it's so important. Our focus is on those 3 KPIs. They're the most important 3 KPIs in any beef herd. Cost of production. We can't hit those targets if our cost of production is more than $1.10. We can't. Herd productivity. Kilograms of beef per DSE is the KPI for that. If you add up the total DSEs in the herd and the total number of kilograms of beef being produced, it's got to be greater than 22. You can't hit those targets if herd productivity isn't churning out 22 kilograms of beef per DSE or more. And finally, labour efficiency. So labour and labour-related expenses for a farm business constitutes 70% of overhead costs and 50% of the total costs of running the business. Labour, wages isn't the whole thing about labour. People drive vehicles which use fuel. The vehicles depreciate. So if you look through all the overhead expenses, there's a whole lot of expenses there that are labour related. And if you don't get your labour efficiency right, you're in trouble. Out here in the Western Districts, 18,000 DSEs per full-time equivalent labour, pretty easy. Go to some other regions, up into New England for example, it'll drop back to 12,000, 13,000. But it's got to be up there somewhere to be competitive today. So we focus on those things. All right, what are the benefits in the Hereford from all of this, and why do we use the Hereford in this cross? Number one, there's a relatively large gene pool here in Australia, which is good, but if you look at the number of herds around that have highly profitable genetics in the white-faced breed, there aren't all that many. This is seed stock herds. There's not many. We can only find a handful, actually, that are preferred suppliers. The seed stock herds that we use as our preferred suppliers are all accessing the larger gene pool of Herefords in the US and are using US genetics to improve certain traits more quickly than they could if they stayed just in Australia. The Hereford breed has good breed plan information relative to most other breeds. That's its biggest advantage. In my time with Herefords that are bred by these preferred suppliers, when it comes around to bull testing time, you walk into a yard full of Hereford bulls, you've got to push the damn things out of the way to get through the yard. They just stand there. You go into the next yard and it's all Angus bulls. You've only got to open the gate and two of them will start fighting. So, temperament, terribly important. Bull longevity and bull costs, which I've alluded to, but I'll get into the detail now. So they're the reasons why we use them. Okay, these data need to be updated. They are just a little bit old now, and I'm in the process of updating them to take into account more recent years. But there's close to 500 bulls in that data set that you can see there. And that breed, obviously, after what I told you earlier, is Angus, right? And then Hereford. Now, I'm not suggesting that these numbers here are representative of the whole breed. They're representative of the breed suppliers that we use on these 6 places. But here's what's happened. Overall, 14% of all bulls that are culled for leg and joint related problems. 71% of them are Angus. Feet related problems, 20% culled on that. It's 50-50 between the two breeds. Penis related problems, broken penis, corkscrew penis, rainbow penis, all sorts of penis problems. It's a big issue. In fact, it's the biggest issue there on that data set. Absolutely, totally dominated by Angus. And the single biggest problem in there is corkscrew penis. And the prevalence of it is increasing, on my data anyway. Herefords haven't got much of it, even the Polies. The horn breeds generally don't have much of a problem here for some reason. It's mostly a pole problem. But the tragedy here is, firstly, it's devastating in terms of herd fertility if that's happening in your herd. It's not easily detectable unless you do a test. The tragedy here is that a team of Queensland researchers, University of Queensland and CSIRO, have actually identified the gene marker for this condition. We could go out and knock this thing on the head tomorrow if we could take the next step. The next step is necessary because they worked out what the gene marker was in the Santa Gertrudis breed alone, and we don't quite know yet whether the same gene marker will occur across other breeds. A proposal for funding that final step went up before a beef research committee, and they knocked it on the head because they said it wasn't a problem. Why isn't it a problem? Because you don't see it unless you look for it. So anyway, I think in the Angus breed the genes are more concentrated. A lot of Angus breeders are looking for the next super sire on the internet every night, and when they find him they'll go out there, and half of the Angus breeders in Australia will be using him next mating, and they tend to congregate the genes a bit more than other breeds by doing that. So that's the big one. Testicles are a non-event in bulls. They're a huge issue in rams, but not in bulls, and the numbers are too low to draw any conclusions from there. Injury, why have the Angus got more injuries? Because they fight. They fight each other. Oh, incidentally, when you mate at more than 2%, especially with Angus, the fighting in the mating paddock because of competition increases the injury rate. Serving ability, again, a low order issue, but dominated by Angus. And non-functional, what's in non-functional? And why are Herefords higher? In non-functional is cancer eye, for example. EBVs fall outside specs after a few years. In other words, the EBVs when the bulls were sold as young bulls have changed. That happens more in the Herefords than it does in the Angus, in my experience. And old age. So this is increasing the figure here for Herefords because the damn things get to an old age and they're still in the herd. Okay. The bottom line on all of that, from my data set, in my data set, Hereford bulls last for an average of 4.9 matings. Angus bulls last for an average of 2.4 matings. That difference completely wipes out the so-called black premium. Wipes it out and more. You start paying money for Angus bulls and they have that sort of breakdown rate, the black premium becomes a farce. So I'll talk more about bull cost per calf wean in a sec. There it is. Here's how we do the calculations. There's an example from a supplier. The bulls are purchased for $5,000. When they break down, they have a residual or sale value of $1,350, say. They've lasted for 5 matings. They've been mated at 2%. The pregnancy or weaning rate's 90%, so the bull will sire 225 calves in his useful life, and the calculations come out to be the bull cost per calf weaned to $16. So here's another lesson from simple data. This bull, in his lifetime, has sired 222 calves. What's his sister done in the same period? She's reared 5 or 6. Should you care about the cows too much? Nope. Should you really place all your emphasis on what's happening with your bull battery? Yep. Because the bull absolutely, totally dominates what's going on in the herd. You'd be surprised at the number of people who think the contribution from either sex is 50-50. It's just not. All right, take these 2 bulls. Bull A, he's got a bull cost per calf weaned of $20. And bull B has a bull cost per calf weaned of $80, which is roughly the difference we see between Hereford bulls and Angus bulls. It's $60. Your weaners are 200 kilos, and you do the simple arithmetic. This bull's weaners are being discounted by 30 cents a kilogram as weaners. Now, if you rocked up to the weaner sale and someone offered you 30 cents less than the going rate, you'd say, go away, I'm not going to accept that. You don't accept it in the weaner sales, a 30-cent discount, but you're perfectly happy to accept it out in the mating paddock, because that's the consequence. Righto. It's completely impossible to purchase bulls from a stud auction if you want to achieve these 2 objectives. Number 1, come away on budget, and number 2, lay down your specs and tighten them up. You can't do it, it's impossible. So what do? Without exception, the first thing we do is we don't go anywhere near bull auctions. They're for people who want to get their photo in the stock and land and all that sort of stuff. We'll stay away. All of our bulls are purchased on a contract basis, always. And this is how we do it. So here's the Hereford breed as an example. And the first thing I need to know is what's the breed average for all 2017 bored Hereford calves across the full EB spectrum. I can't get them all on the one page, so I've split it into 2. So here's the breed average. Then I'll go to my preferred supplier and I'll say, give me your figures for exactly the same period. And in this example, this is a real supplier here, and I'll come back to these in a minute. And there's the other half of the EBV suite there. So I can instantly see where that supplier sits in relation to the breed overall. And if I collect these data year on year, I can see the direction he's taking or she is taking over time and what particular traits that breeder is working on. Years ago, my business partner and I, David Sackett, pardon me, drew up a 10-point list of all the boxes you had to tick to become a preferred supplier in beef seed stock. The top of the list is, would you buy a used car from this person? That knocked most of them out. But down on the list further was, can this person describe exactly where their herd will be 10 years from now? Because that's going to affect my bottom line. Now, if the answer is, well, they'll have more Springer rib, they'll stand over their ground a bit better, and the bulls will have a good sire outlook. Very interesting, thanks, but see you later. Don't want to know you. I want a supplier to sit down and tell me what these numbers will look like 10 years from now. So we've got our suppliers organised. Then we set our specs, taking into account where he is in relation to breed average. We start to say, okay, the average of all the bulls that we get from you under contract this year has to be somewhere near these figures. So we like calving ease, that's good. We like a little bit of growth, but note there that the growth is not terribly dramatic, it's above breed average, and that's okay. We're more interested in what happens between 600 and mature cow, and we want that growth curve to be bent, as they say, so we don't end up with great big grass hungry cows. This issue of mature cow weight and the influence of big hungry cows, and big hungry ewes by the way, is only just starting to be discussed now, and people are just starting to understand it. But believe me, from an economic point of view, great big females are bad news. And we carry on across here. I want as much scrotal size as I can get for all sorts of reasons. I want days to calving. So this particular supplier hasn't been concentrating much on days to calving, as you can see here. He's been really pushing IMF, and he's really been pushing EMA. I don't care about carcass weight, it's irrelevant to me. That matters to me terribly, a lot. Now the evidence is starting to emerge just now, and again hasn't been widely discussed in the industry, but there's a very good link between some carcass traits and herd fertility. And it's all to do with where the energy reserves in the body are stored. So there's 3 energy reserves in beef cattle anyway. One of them is the glycogen stored in muscle, which can be released to maintain cyclic activity. Similarly with IMF, that fat can be mobilised very quickly and easily. Rib and rump fats, which used to be terribly important to me and a lot of others in the industry, we don't regard so favourably now because they take too long to break down. So if I can get some carcass traits in there that are going to improve my chances of grading MSA, if I can get that, and at the same time I've got a fertility bonus, it's a no-brainer. You've just got to do it. So overall though, look at this. This is the grain-fed index. This is the breed average. This is where this particular supplier is in 2017, and this is where we're saying we would like to be with the bulls that he supplies. So we sit down with the supplier and he looks at our specs and he says, yes, I can give you everything. We might have to tweak this one a bit, that one a bit, but the average of all the bulls you'll get from me this year and for the next couple of years will be able to meet those specs. And if we do agree there, we sit down and sign a contract that is binding for 3 years. We will change the specs every 3 years and we will review how we're going. If the bull cost per calf born in that contract period creeps above $30, we will sit down and say, this is unacceptable. We are not going to pay as much for the next lot of contract bulls as we've paid for this lot. They've got to be cheaper. And you can fix it if you want to. That sorts them out pretty quickly. To wind up, number one, I think you guys are underselling the breed, for God's sake. There's so much going for it, especially on bull costs. No one talks about bull costs per calf born, but you've seen from the numbers I've put up, it has a fairly potent financial effect on the herd. I think the gene pool of excellent Hereford genetics is too small in Australia, and that needs to be expanded. That's happening, I think. All right, let's go a bit controversial. Those two things here are related, and just as an outsider, total outsider looking in, I think if you guys spent a little less time squabbling with one another and going out and promoting the breed more effectively, it'd be a really good thing. Right, there's no rocket science needed to emulate the performance of these 6 herds. There's no rocket science at all. It is just science and economics based. So I think they're the major obstacles, and I have to say that it hasn't been me at all that's made this happen. All I have done is to be the messenger for science and economics. If you let them take over, you won't go wrong. In all of my 40 years in the industry, I've always worked with Herefords as either being the sole breed or part of a breed cross. And they've never let me down in terms of what I've been expecting to happen in the herd. They haven't. So I've got confidence. Going on what Jack's told us that's happened in the US, all you seed stock producers in Australia with Herefords have got the world at your feet based on what he's shown can be done. And I would encourage you to do so. Thank you, folks.